Hi, this is Dan Deppen, and this is the first of my video series on using Excel for mortgage notes. And in the beginning of this series, I want to focus on tips for making professional looking spreadsheets. It's a subject that I think gets overlooked a lot. Even very experienced Excel users a lot of times will make, spreadsheets that are very cluttered, difficult to modify, confusing for other people to use. And so I think this is one of those things that will really get you on your way to making some really good solid Excel spreadsheets. So I'm actually going to start this, even though this is a video on Excel, I'm actually going to start in PowerPoint, and then I'm going to open up a sample Excel spreadsheet that I have and run through an example. So first of all, why is this so important? Oops. And it's important for a lot of reasons, but mainly you want to make a good impression on people, namely your JV partners or funding partners. You hand someone a spreadsheet that's nasty looking and cluttered, that can be a reflection on you. So you don't want to give them some spreadsheet that they can't even read or can't even find what the outputs are, and say, hey, there's a great ROI here. That may not leave the best impression. So I want to be able to have you put your best foot forward at all times. We also want to reduce errors, and that's critical in this business. Obviously, making an error on a spreadsheet can be extremely, extremely expensive, both for you and for your funded partners. Errors can be devastating, so I'll give you some tips on best practices that'll help you make it a lot harder to make errors. These are also going to make it easier to modify the spreadsheet later. I don't know how many times I've created a very elaborate spreadsheet and then a few months go by and I go back to try to use it again, or I go back to modify it and I have a hard time figuring out what the heck was going on with that. And it can be very tedious to pick through it and dissect what you were doing on that spreadsheet initially and pick it up. So with some of these formatting tips and guidelines, will make it a lot easier to pick up a spreadsheet later that maybe you've forgotten the details of what you were doing at the time. It can also make these easier to share. Now granted, in the note world, shouldn't really be sharing a whole lot of spreadsheets or particularly ROI calculators. This applies a lot more to the corporate world. I know in my day job, routinely have to share spreadsheets with other people. So I want to make that easy on them. And basically we're trying to avoid, things like this. We don't want spreadsheets where everything just kind of blahs together and looks the same and you can't tell what's the important information or the not important information. At the same time, that doesn't mean you just go bananas adding all kinds of formatting and all kinds of colors and doing things that are going to make someone's eyes bleed. We want to stay away from that as well. So what is it we actually want to do? So let me open up Excel spreadsheet here. Clean this up a little bit. Oop. It's over here. There we go. So here's a spreadsheet I put together just for sample purposes for this video. This is not a real ROI calculator, so don't get wrapped around the axle on what any of the values are or what I'm actually calculating. I just wanted something to use that looked kind of similar to what you would do with notes for the sake of this video. So what I did was I took a ROI calculator that I built for performing notes, deformatted it, cut off a lot of data, simplified it, and then put in a lot of placeholder values for these things. So don't get wrapped around the axle on what the actual values are. In future videos, I'm going to go into detail on how to do loan analysis and build ROI calculators and all that kind of fun stuff. For the sake of today, we're just talking about formatting. And so tip number one is separate your inputs and outputs, which I've actually already done in this spreadsheet. So here I've got a set of global inputs, basically my costs that are going to apply to all of these notes. And what I've got here is kind of a sample tape that I'm looking at. Down here I've got some input variables for the notes themselves. Some of these actually refer back to my raw data in my tape. And again, this is very simplified. I mean, as you know, these tapes might have 50 plus columns. So sometimes what I do is just copy that raw data in and then reference those values back to where I'm actually doing the worksheet where I'm actually doing my ROI calculations. So keep those inputs and outputs separated. Format your headers. So these would be my headers for my notes. So use a different background color. You want to use something that's pretty neutral, not too in your face. So something like that. I like to use all caps for the headers, which I've already got in here. And then a bold font and an underline. And then some of these I like to wrap the text, make this bigger, and then some of these columns kind of shrink to go to 2 rows so I can kind of consolidate my data a little bit. There we go. So now I got my headers formatted. Aligning your data. So we want to left align the text data and right align the numerical data. So I got some of my text data here that will left justify our left align. And this basically just cleans things up and it makes it easier to see what's what within the spreadsheet. Using white space, this is another thing that not many people do effectively, but we kind of want to make everything, we don't want our data and our cells to be crowded in like they are right now by default. Microsoft Excel, if it takes the default cell sizes, get pretty small around the data. And so usually you want to open those up a little bit. So if you look at what our row heights are, oops, that's not what I wanted. My row height. So the default is 14, so we might open that up to say 18 or 20. Of course, now I made this thing too small. So you can, if you want to auto size the row height, you can double click the bottom line there, then it'll auto size. And again, that's kind of scrunched. So my row height went to 28. So I might open that up to say 36. You can also manually drag it, of course. And then I highly recommend turning off the grid lines. So these grid lines come in here by default. If you ever notice, they don't actually print. These are really just for the purposes of trying to make it easier to get data aligned, but usually you don't really need those. So I'm going to go under page layout and then turn off the grid lines. And of course, I'm using, I think this is Excel 2016 on a Mac, depending on the version of Excel you're using, whether it's Mac or Windows. Some of these picks that I show might be in different places, so your mileage is going to vary a little bit, but in general, the grid line view should be somewhere under page layout. Now this is a big one, using font to indicate the type of data. This is something I learned when I took an Excel, a 2-day Excel training class while I was doing my MBA. And it was a training class that was taught by some folks who train investment bankers on Wall Street. And I'm not an investment banker. I've never been one. But there were a lot of good tips, namely this one. So I talked earlier about keeping your inputs and outputs separated. So I did that physically on the spreadsheet, but we also want to do that with the font size. So you want to put your inputs in blue. Oops. So blue. And then actually this was an input I had as well. So I've got some that are global inputs, some that are others. Your calculations and your outputs, you can just leave those at black. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it really easy if you go back and modify the spreadsheet or want to make changes. you can see exactly the knobs to turn. The last thing you want to do is when you're working on a spreadsheet or making changes, overwrite a formula. Like I don't want to, go in here where I have a formula and overwrite that and then not realize I overwrote it. And then now I've got, some rows that have a formula and other rows that have a hardwired number. That's a good way to ultimately make an error, so we want to keep those separate. Now green is a link from another worksheet. So in this one, I have my raw data, which would represent, my raw tape, and actually reference those values, some of those values back there. So my UPB is referencing the raw data, same as my note rate, my payment. Okay, so these I'm going to put in green. And that's just telling me that these are basically inputs, but they're referencing back to this other spreadsheet. So I know if I want to go and make changes, or I want to add rows, or I want to look at something else, it just alerts me that, oh, these are coming from somewhere else. And I can see, I can click on it and go, oh, that's the raw data tab. That's actually referencing over here. Now, red would be either a warning of something to go back and look at, or a link from another spreadsheet. So green is from another tab or a worksheet. Excel will also let you make links from actual other spreadsheets. I don't recommend doing that. I've done it before, and what always happens is those links always end up getting broken because you've moved files from one place to another, or if you send a file to someone and they don't have the file that has the reference links, then you get errors and messages, and it's a real pain to debug. But if you do decide to do that and you put those in red, it'll make that debugging process easier later on. You can also use red if you want to remind yourself to go back and look at something. So for me, in this one, just to give an example, you could say, well, gee, I'm assuming no other costs, maybe, I'm going to have something later. I want to actually go back and verify that I'm not missing something up here. Or, maybe these are going through a broker and I don't know, and I want to go back and double check that. But I think that's really one of my best tips for really making spreadsheets easy to modify and easy to understand what's going on. I think just doing that makes your life a heck of a lot easier. And then finally, if we're putting totals at the bottom, we want to format those as well. So these are individual notes, but say, for example, we were buying these as part of a pool. So maybe there are some totals that we care about. So maybe I want to know the total UPB for the pool. And maybe I want to know total price that I'm going to pay. And then I want to know the total percent of UPB. So just my column width, a little room. There. We've got those in there. And I like to underline the last row of data so it's kind of clear where the breakpoint is between my data and my totals. And then bold these. So there you go. There's 6 fairly quick tips to help make cleaner and more professional looking Excel spreadsheets. I have a lot more on formatting and of course on node analysis coming up. I'm trying to keep these videos on the short side, as short as possible. I know ideally I like to keep them in the 5 to 10 minute range. I know this one probably went a little bit longer. So anyhow, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.